While no one can see into the future, we can at least predict, based on current data, what we think are the future trends for global health. And there are some things that we think are fairly likely. We know, for example, that global life expectancy will likely increase from 70 now to about 73 by, say, 2030. And life expectancy in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa will likely increase from 56 now to 63, a really significant impact. We also know that, according to the trends, there will be some significant changes in mortality. Now, if we look at expected shifts for mortality until 2030, we see some fascinating changes as well. This time, let's go back to 2016 and let's look at what were the top 10 causes of mortality. Heart disease, stroke, COPD, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, lower respiratory tract infection, lung cancer, diarrheal diseases, diabetes, road injury, and tuberculosis. Shifting forward to 2030, we see some interesting similarities and some fascinating differences. Heart disease, stroke, COPD, still our top 3 causes, followed by lower respiratory tract infection. Now, why is this moving up? Because in an aging world, as I've said earlier, the elderly are more prone to get pneumonia. And in a world whose population is also increasing at the same time, children are more likely to die of pneumonia as well, especially in under-resourced settings. But what I really want to point out that's so interesting is diabetes. Notice how diabetes has moved up, because as NCDs gain in prominence and the world gets heavier with higher body mass indices or BMIs, as we move to what is now being called fat planet, we're going to see diabetes and diabetes-related conditions on the rise. If you look at specific regions, we still see, however, that in Afro, infectious disease still will be the top 2 causes, HIV, AIDS, and lower respiratory infection, then followed by stroke and heart disease, and then diarrhea. Though again, remember, when we disaggregate data, we'll see that's going to vary from country to country. Southeast Asia, ischemic heart disease, stroke, COPD, non-communicable diseases, all, by the way, which can be exacerbated by smoking. And then we have lower respiratory infections, diarrhea, and then diabetes and road injury. Notice how we see these patterns arising. PAHO, the Americas, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and dementias, something that's not shown up earlier. And that's primarily because the increased number of older people and, in fact, increasing life expectancy and increasing age of populations, in particular in the United States and Canada. Interpersonal violence is here, unfortunately. A lot of that has to do with what is happening in the Americas now with the increase in narco trafficking. Putting aside mortality, let's talk about DALYs. What kinds of changes can we expect to see? Well, let's look at the 2010 data. Our top 10 DALYs were lower respiratory infection, diarrhea, low back pain, depression, heart disease, HIV, AIDS, stroke, premature birth, low birth weight, birth asphyxia and trauma, and neonatal infections. Some significant shifts are taking place. Number 1, depression, followed by heart disease, traffic accidents, stroke, COPD. Then we get to our first infection, lower respiratory infections, followed by hearing and vision loss, HIV, AIDS, diabetes, and diarrhea. Notice how, for the most part, in terms of DALYs, which don't necessarily kill people, it's a combination, right, of causes of mortality and years of life, lost, right, due to disability, right? In other words, sickness or morbidity, we're seeing that the impact of infectious disease dropping all the more, while the impact of non-communicable disease and type 3 disorders, right, injuries on a very high rise, primarily due to traffic accidents. Now, when you put this together, why do you think that you might see this scenario? Let's compare mortality in 2030, predicted mortality in 2030, to predicted DALYs in 2030. What do you see? What does this information tell us? Take a moment to think about that before moving on to my next slide. I think what it tells us is that our future of global health is showing some really interesting changes. And I put those in chock-a-block. I think we will see that because of the demographic shift, there is an increase in non-communicable diseases, including dementias. Clearly, things like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS in particular, will still be with us, right? But they will not be playing as prominent a role. Climate change and population growth is going to increase competition for land and water, increasing potential for violence and conflict. Unfortunately, we're going to see climate change reducing food supplies, increasing natural disasters, displacing coastal population. Gender inequity and child morbidity and mortality are going to attenuate, but they still will cause major harm. We're still going to define that the social determinants are with us, right? And we're also going to see that increased development and infrastructures is going to cause an increase of traffic and other injuries. All of these are implied by looking at our future changes, our predicted changes in global health. The bottom line is future global health trends will see an increase in type 2 and 3 disorders, but type 1 disorders will remain a significant burden, especially in the global south.